He tightened his grip around the wrist of his heavily pregnant wife, pinning her against the side of a black car in the silent lot behind the restaurant. And he had no idea that the woman stepping out the back door, still carrying the scent of coffee and the sweat of a 12-hour shift, would be the one to bring his entire world crashing down within a matter of days. She was just a poor waitress. No money, no power, no one standing behind her. But that night, beneath the dim yellow lights and the first cold rain of a Chicago winter, she did the one thing no one else in the crowd had ever dared to do. She stepped forward. And what she could never have imagined was that the pregnant woman she risked everything to save that night was the younger sister of the most powerful and ruthless man in the city. There are moments in life when a single step is all it takes to change everything. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you hold dear, and subscribe to our channel to walk alongside us through the stories of courage and kindness still waiting ahead. The parking lot behind the Ironwood had never been a pleasant place on the first cold nights of winter. Sickly yellow light spilled across the rain-streaked asphalt, and the distant hum of Chicago's engines only made the empty lot feel more desolate. Delaney Cole pulled the collar of her thin coat up beneath her chin, still holding the keys to her old car, when the clang of metal echoed from a dark corner beyond the row of parked vehicles. She stopped. A man's voice came next, low and strangled with anger, followed by the pleading voice of a woman, faint and fragile as a thread about to snap. Delaney looked toward the sound and saw the shadow of a large man pinning a heavily pregnant woman against the side of a sleek black car. His hand was locked around her wrist, and his entire body loomed over her like a collapsing wall, leaving his victim no path of escape. For one moment, Delaney's whole body went rigid. It wasn't because of the cold. It was something deeper, something old rising from the bottom of her heart, a blurred image of a small room long ago, of a tightly closed door, and the sound of muffled sobbing behind it. She wouldn't let herself remember anymore. She simply stood there, her heart pounding, her legs heavy as though they had been buried in the wet concrete beneath her feet. The old instinct inside her whispered that she should turn away, do what so many others had once done, pretend she hadn't heard anything, walk to her car, start the engine, and drive away as fast as she could. That would be the safe thing to do. That was what a poor woman alone in the world, with a young child waiting for her at home, was supposed to do. Delaney had already turned halfway around. Her fingers had tightened around the keys. Then the pregnant woman pleaded again, and this time her voice sounded more broken, carrying a desperation Delaney understood far too well, so well that it made her chest tighten. She thought of someone who had once cried out for help in the same way, on a night buried deep in the past, and no one had come. The thought struck her like a hand shoving hard against her back. Before she could weigh the risks or think about what she stood to lose, Delaney turned around, let the keys fall to the ground, and strode toward the darkness. "Hey," she shouted, her voice carrying farther than she had expected. "Let her go right now." The man jerked his head around. Beneath the light, his face came into view, cold and dangerously handsome, his eyes still blazing with anger that hadn't begun to fade. His name was Chad Whitmore. Though Delaney didn't know that yet, all she saw was a man and doing the very thing she had hated all her life, and that was more than enough. "This is none of your business," he said, his voice deep and threatening. "Walk away before you regret it." "I'm not going anywhere," Delaney replied, though her knees were trembling. "She's pregnant. Do you even understand what you're doing?" The pregnant woman lifted her eyes to Delaney. They were filled with tears and a silent, overwhelming terror. Her name was Isabella. Her lips moved as though she wanted to say something, perhaps a warning, perhaps a plea, but no sound came out. Chad glared at Delaney, then released his wife's wrist and turned fully toward the strange young woman who had dared to interfere. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he said through clenched teeth as he stepped closer. "Some little waitress thinks she can lecture me." Delaney didn't retreat. She moved directly between him and Isabella, stretching one arm behind her, as though to shield the woman shrinking against the car. Her heart was screaming at her to be afraid, but something stronger than fear kept her feet planted firmly on the ground. "I'm nobody," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But I'm not going to stand here and watch." The anger in Chad's eyes flared. He swung his arm and shoved her hard. The blow struck Delaney's shoulder, sending her stumbling off balance before she fell sprawling onto the cold, wet concrete. Her palms burned as they scraped against the rough ground. For 1 second, the entire world spun beneath the yellow lights, and she heard Isabella break into sobs somewhere close beside her. But Delaney didn't stay down for long. She gritted her teeth, pressed her hands against the pavement, and forced herself upright, her brown hair falling loose and clinging to her rain-dampened cheeks. She rose slowly but with determination, then stepped between him and the pregnant woman once again, this time standing even closer than before. "You want to hit someone tonight," Delaney said, breathing hard, "then hit me. But you won't touch her again." There was something in her eyes, an unyielding defiance that refused to break, and it made Chad hesitate for a moment. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, least of all by a small woman in a wrinkled waitress uniform. His gaze swept across the parking lot, as though he had suddenly remembered that the place wasn't as private as he had believed, then returned to Isabella with cold contempt. At that exact moment, Isabella let out a sudden cry of pain. She folded forward, clutching her stomach with both hands, and her already pale face turned as white as paper. She staggered against the side of the car, her knees gave way, and she began sliding toward the frozen ground. A short, broken breath escaped her chest. Delaney spun around, and every part of her attention immediately shifted to the woman collapsing before her. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized that something terribly wrong had just begun. Delaney dropped to her knees beside Isabella, slipping one arm behind the trembling woman's back, while her other hand immediately pulled the old phone from her coat pocket. Her fingers moved quickly across the freezing screen and pressed the 3 familiar numbers anyone could remember in a moment of panic. After only 2 rings, a calm female voice answered and asked what kind of emergency she was calling about. Delaney fought to keep her voice from breaking, as she explained that a pregnant woman who seemed to be going into labor was in severe pain and might be in danger, in the parking lot behind the Ironwood on Wells Street. The dispatcher asked several more questions, then told her that the nearest ambulance was already responding to another call, and wouldn't reach them for nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Delaney heard those words and felt as though a block of ice had crashed down onto her chest. She looked at Isabella, doubled over in agony, her lips clenched so tightly that they had begun to bleed, beads of sweat gathering across her forehead despite the cold, and Delaney understood that 20 minutes might be too long, so long that nothing could be done by the time help finally arrived. She lifted her head and searched for Chad, but the man had already backed several steps away and was standing frozen in the darkness between 2 rows of cars, something flickering in his eyes between panic and calculation. He looked at his wife writhing on the ground, then at Delaney, then toward the entrance of the parking lot, as though he were weighing whether he should run. For one brief moment, the cruelty that had twisted his face earlier was gone, leaving only the naked cowardice of a man who felt powerful only when he stood over someone weaker than himself. Then he turned sharply, strode into the darkness, and vanished from the parking lot so quickly that Delaney didn't even have time to call after him. She didn't waste a second being angry. Strangely enough, his absence made her feel relieved, because now she had only 1 life to worry about, or rather, 2 lives, both of them resting in her hands. She leaned close to Isabella's ear and told her clearly that she wasn't going to wait for the ambulance, that she would drive her to the hospital right now, because Mercy West Hospital was only a few minutes away, and that would be far faster than sitting there in the rain. Isabella gave a weak nod, and Delaney slipped an arm beneath hers, using every ounce of strength she had to help the pregnant woman to her feet. Step by step, the 2 women supported each other across the slick parking lot. Delaney was forced to carry almost all of Isabella's weight across her shoulders, and her worn shoes slipped several times on the wet pavement, nearly sending them both down, but she kept forcing herself forward. She opened the rear door of her old car, carefully lowered Isabella onto the seat, then hurriedly folded her own coat and placed it beneath the woman's head. Delaney rushed into the driver's seat, pushed the key into the ignition, and the aging engine coughed several times before finally turning over. The car pulled out of the parking lot and merged onto the rain-slick streets beneath Chicago's dim yellow streetlights. Delaney gripped the steering wheel, straining to see through the windshield as rain lashed across the glass, and pressed the accelerator harder than she had ever dared in her life. In the back seat, Isabella moaned softly with every contraction, and between broken breaths, she began to plead. She begged Delaney to save the baby, She said she could endure anything, only please don't let her lose her child, the baby she had been waiting for through 8 long months. Hearing those words, Delaney felt her throat close. She glanced into the rearview mirror, at the pale face of the stranger behind her, and spoke with a certainty she didn't truly feel, telling Isabella to save her strength and stop talking, that they were almost there, and that she promised she would get both mother and child to safety. Delaney didn't know where she found the confidence to make such a promise, but in that moment, she needed Isabella to believe it, and she needed to believe it herself. The next few minutes passed like a tense and feverish dream, filled with the squeak of the windshield wipers, the rain hammering against the roof, and the weakening breaths of the woman behind her. When the glowing sign of Mercy West Hospital finally appeared at the end of the street, Delaney nearly burst into tears from relief. She drove straight to the emergency entrance, slammed on the brakes, jumped from the car, and shouted for help. Within seconds, medical workers in uniform rushed outside with a stretcher. They lifted Isabella from the car with swift, practiced movements, placed her on the gurney, and surrounded her in a circle of urgent activity. Delaney ran beside them until an arm stopped her at the threshold, and the double doors of the emergency department swung shut directly in front of her, leaving her standing alone beneath the cold white lights of the hallway. She stepped back, sank onto a nearby plastic chair, and only then, when everything had finally grown quiet, did she realize that both of her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and that her sleeves were stained with dirt and rainwater. Delaney sat motionless on the hard plastic chair, for a length of time she could no longer measure, her eyes fixed on the double doors of the emergency department as she listened to every hurried footstep echoing from inside. Time carried a weight of its own in a hospital. It moved with suffocating slowness, each passing minute stretching like a cord pulled so tight it was ready to snap. She clasped her hands together, now that they had begun to stop trembling, and offered an awkward prayer for a woman whose name she hadn't even had the chance to ask. At last, the doors swung open, and a doctor dressed in blue scrubs stepped into the hallway, pulling down his mask to reveal a face worn with exhaustion but grave with concern. He glanced along the empty corridor, and when he saw that Delaney was the only person waiting there in a wrinkled waitress uniform, he walked toward her and asked whether she was the one who had brought the pregnant woman to the hospital. Delaney sprang to her feet, nodded, and immediately asked whether the woman was all right and whether the baby was safe. The doctor released a long breath, then told her in a low voice that both mother and child had survived the crisis, but it had been a race against time, with every moment counting. He told her plainly that if she had arrived even 10 minutes later, there was a very real chance they wouldn't have been able to save either the mother or the child. The words left Delaney completely still. She reached for the back of the chair as her legs seemed to soften beneath her, and a rush of warmth gathered painfully behind her eyes. 10 minutes. She had stood on that fragile dividing line without ever realizing it, and it was her recklessness, her refusal to wait even 1 second longer, that had pulled 2 human lives back from the edge. The doctor added that the patient was now being monitored and needed rest, then excused himself and returned through the doors. Delaney remained alone in the hallway, and when the first surge of emotion began to settle, another feeling slowly crept into her heart. It was the awareness that she didn't belong there. She had done what needed to be done, the woman was safe, and now she should quietly leave before anyone began asking questions, before trouble she couldn't afford found its way into her life. She had a young child waiting at home, a shift the next morning, and an entire life already strained to its limits, a life she couldn't allow to become any more tangled than it already was. She bent down to gather the soaking coat draped over her arm, pulled the worn strap of her handbag back onto her shoulder, and started toward the exit, her thin-soled shoes making soft scraping sounds against the polished tile floor. But she hadn't gone far when something beyond the hospital's glass doors caused the entire space to fall suddenly still. A long, imposing black sports utility vehicle glided to a stop in front of the emergency entrance with unmistakable purpose, its headlights sweeping a cold beam across the glass. Almost at once, the atmosphere in the hospital corridor changed. A nurse pushing a medication cart stopped moving. A security guard straightened his back, and even the people seated in the distant waiting area lifted their heads and looked outside with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The doors of the vehicle opened, and two broad-shouldered men in dark suits stepped out first, taking positions on either side with the bearing of men accustomed to clearing a path. Then a third man emerged from the back seat, and the way he appeared was enough by itself to silence everyone watching. He was tall and powerfully built, dressed in a black suit tailored to fit every line of his body. His stride slow but commanding, neither hurried nor hesitant, he pushed through the glass doors and entered. And as though some invisible order had passed through the air, everyone standing along the walkway instinctively moved aside to let him through. There were no shouted commands and no spoken instructions, only a heavy silence wrapped around him like armor. He was Salvatore Marchetti, a man both respected and feared throughout Chicago, though Delaney still had no idea who he was. He approached the reception desk and asked the rigid employee behind it something in a voice so quiet she could barely hear him. Then his gaze moved slowly down the corridor, cold and sharp as tempered steel, until it came to rest on the small woman, still dressed in a stained waitress uniform, standing frozen in the middle of the hallway before she could reach the door. Salvatore Marchetti walked toward her, with measured steps that carried an unmistakable weight. And within seconds, the two broad-shouldered men accompanying him shifted silently into position, standing at angles behind Delaney, like a living wall closing around her in a wordless circle. She felt the change immediately. The sensation of being surrounded by those massive bodies and their searching eyes sent a chill down her spine, but she forced herself to stand straight and refused to let them see how wildly her heart was beating. The man in the black suit stopped about an arm's length away and looked her over from head to toe with dark, emotionless eyes, as though he were reading every detail of her, from her wet brown hair clinging to her face to the stained waitress uniform covering her body. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice so low and quiet that Delaney had to strain to hear him. Yet that very softness was more frightening than any shout could have been. He asked why she was there, why she had been the one to bring his sister to this hospital, and what she had done to her. Every word carried a cold suspicion, the vigilance of a man accustomed to finding betrayal everywhere he looked, and beneath it lay an anger restrained so tightly that it had become dangerous. Delaney swallowed hard, and in that moment, she understood that if she showed fear, if she hesitated or tried to avoid his questions, this man would crush her without a second thought. But she was too tired, too exhausted after the long night, and she had nothing to hide, so instead of trembling, she lifted her chin, looked straight into those cold eyes, and answered with a calmness that surprised even her. "My name is Delaney Cole," she said. "I'm a waitress at the restaurant where this happened. I don't know her. I didn't know who she was, and I don't know who you are. I saw a pregnant woman in danger, so I brought her here. If you're looking for the person who hurt her, then you're looking at the wrong woman." The directness of her answer, with no hesitation and no attempt to soften the truth, seemed to make Salvatore pause for the briefest moment. He was accustomed to people lowering their heads in front of him, accustomed to eyes that darted away, voices that stammered with fear, and the obedience his power always brought. But this small woman in a wrinkled uniform looked directly at him without blinking. Her voice didn't tremble, and in her tired gray eyes there was none of the fear he usually saw. There was only honest exhaustion and a trace of stubbornness he couldn't understand. It made him study her more carefully and for longer than before, as though he were trying to understand what kind of woman she was. "Could you tell your men to step back?" Delaney continued when he remained silent and kept watching her. "I just drove halfway across the city through the rain to save your sister, and I truly don't have the strength to be surrounded like a criminal. If you don't believe me, ask the doctor, check the cameras, do whatever you want. But I've already told you the truth." A heavy silence passed between them, and in that moment, something difficult to name flickered in Salvatore's eyes. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a new kind of attention, a curiosity he hadn't felt in a very long time. Just then, the door to the treatment area behind them opened, and a nurse stepped out to say that the patient was awake and asking for the woman who had saved her. Salvatore immediately turned and strode inside, and after a moment of hesitation, Delaney followed. Isabella lay pale and weak in the hospital bed, but when her eyes found Delaney, a fragile smile appeared on her face. She reached out with a trembling hand and said in a faint, broken voice that this was the woman who had saved her, that without her, she and the baby wouldn't still be alive. and that Delaney had stepped forward while everyone else had only stood and watched. Salvatore stood silently beside his sister's bed and listened to every word she said. Then he slowly turned his head and looked at Delaney again. This time, his expression was completely different. The cold suspicion from before was gone, replaced by something very rare in a man like him, a quiet respect mingled with a gratitude he himself didn't yet know how to express. That night, after leaving the hospital, with a promise that his men would remain stationed outside his sister's room until morning, Salvatore Marchetti returned to his penthouse on the highest floor of a glass tower in the heart of Chicago. Beyond the windows, stretching from floor to ceiling, the entire city spread beneath him like a vast tapestry, woven from millions of points of light, its streets threaded with streams of headlights reaching all the way to the horizon, the dark river bending through the city and reflecting the glow of the towers above it. This was the city whose every hidden corner of power he had spent nearly his entire life learning to enter, a place where one phone call from him could set invisible machinery into motion, force locked doors to open, and make people ordinary citizens would never meet suddenly willing to listen to every word he said. But that night, standing before the familiar view, Salvatore felt none of the satisfaction of a man who ruled. Instead, a cold and steady anger burned quietly inside his chest, the anger of a man who had just realized that the only family he had left had nearly died in the very city he believed he controlled completely. He poured himself a glass of liquor, but didn't drink it. He left it untouched on the stone table and began to think, slowly and sharply, about the question that kept piercing his mind like a thorn. How could this have happened without him knowing? He picked up his phone and called the man he trusted most, a man named Frank who had served him for years and understood every corner of his network better than anyone else. In only a few brief sentences, Salvatore ordered Frank to uncover everything connected to Chad Whitmore, his sister's husband, and he wanted to know it all, from the money Chad spent and the places he frequented to every person he associated with. But what truly Salvatore came from another detail, Frank reported hesitantly later that night. Rumors had been circulating that Chad's wife had occasionally appeared, with bruises she had tried clumsily to conceal, and at least one person within Salvatore's own inner circle had heard whispers about it months earlier, but had chosen to remain silent, never saying a word to him. When Salvatore heard that, he set the phone down very gently, and for one moment the vast room sank into a silence so complete it was unnerving. To him there was no greater offense than betrayal through silence, and nothing enraged him more than knowing that someone beneath his command had been aware that his sister was being hurt and had still chosen to look away to protect himself. He didn't shout, break anything, or reveal even the slightest outward sign of the fury churning inside him. That was what made Salvatore Marchetti truly frightening, because his anger never flared like fire. It hardened into ice, and once it did, the consequences became unavoidable. The next morning, he summoned the man who had remained silent to a private room inside a building he owned, and the conversation between them was brief, quiet, and unheard by anyone outside. People knew only that after that morning, the man's name was never mentioned again in any conversation within their world, and he himself quietly vanished from Chicago, leaving for some distant place no one bothered to ask about. There was no disturbance and no spectacle, only an empty space where a person had once been. And that silence said everything about the price of betraying the trust of a man like Salvatore. The others in his network understood the lesson without needing it explained, and from that day forward, their voices dropped whenever they spoke his name. Yet beneath the cold steel exterior of the most powerful man in the city, there was something none of them could see. The image of the small woman in the waitress uniform kept returning to his mind, a stranger who had dared to do what his entire network of power had failed to do, protect his sister when she needed it most. The next morning, Delaney returned to the hospital, though she couldn't quite explain to herself why she had done it. She told herself she only wanted to make certain the woman was all right, that it was what any decent person with a conscience would do. But deep inside, some invisible thread kept drawing her back to this place, back to the side of the stranger she had risked herself to save in the rain the night before. She carried a small bouquet she had bought in haste from a stand in the lobby, inexpensive flowers that had still made her hesitate before spending the little tip money she had earned during her previous shift. then walked along the upper floor corridor in search of Isabella's room. When she reached the partially open door, she lifted a hand to knock, but stopped when the scene inside made her unwilling to disturb the silence. Through the narrow opening, she saw Salvatore Marchetti sitting beside his sister's hospital bed, and he looked nothing like the cold, commanding man she had met the night before. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together, and he was holding Isabella's sleeping hand with a tenderness so unexpected it was almost difficult to believe, as though he feared that even the slightest pressure might cause her pain. His broad shoulders, the shoulders that always seemed to carry authority with such rigid certainty, were now bowed beneath some invisible burden, and on the face that seemed incapable of revealing emotion, Delaney caught a glimpse of something she had never imagined she would see in a man like him: helplessness. Standing silently outside the door, Delaney had no way of knowing that in that moment, Salvatore's thoughts were drifting back toward a distant part of his life he had always tried to bury. He remembered the fateful night, many years earlier, when he had been only 19, and Isabella had still been a little girl. He remembered the telephone ringing in the middle of the night, remembered the cold voice telling him that their parents had died in an accident he would later understand had never been an accident at all. And he remembered the ground seeming to collapse beneath his feet when he realized that from that moment on, he was alone in the world with a small sister who needed him to protect her. He had cast aside his youth, cast aside all the dreams a 19-year-old boy should have been allowed to possess, and thrown himself into a dark and merciless world, doing things he would never speak of again, all so he could gain enough strength and power to shield his little sister from the world that had taken their parents away. He had built an empire, made an entire city fear his name, and told himself that everything he had done was so no one would ever be able to touch the person he loved again. And yet now, sitting beside that hospital bed, looking at Isabella's pale face, and thinking of the wounds she had silently endured for so long beneath the roof of her own home, Salvatore suddenly faced a truth so bitter it left him numb. All the power he had built, all the wealth and influence that made the city afraid of him, all the networks and people within his reach, had meant nothing when the danger had come from inside his sister's own home, from the very man he had trusted enough to give her to. He could buy almost anything in the world. He could make his enemies tremble with a single nod, but he hadn't been able to buy safety for the only person left in the world whom he truly loved. That helplessness tormented him more deeply than any physical wound ever could. Outside the door, Delaney quietly stepped back, suddenly feeling as though she were intruding upon a moment far too private, a pain the man inside had never intended anyone to witness. And somewhere within her, the way she saw Salvatore Marchetti began to change, because for the first time, she understood that behind the cold shell of steel was still a human being, a man carrying a wound no different from the wounds she herself had always kept hidden. It took several more days before Isabella was strong enough to sit up in her hospital bed and speak clearly. And throughout those days, Salvatore scarcely left the hospital, while Delaney continued to stop by whenever her shift ended, sometimes bringing a box of fruit, sometimes only a few simple words of concern. Little by little, a strange closeness began to form among the three people who had once been complete strangers, a bond none of them tried to name. And it was within that fragile warmth, one afternoon as pale sunlight spilled through the hospital window, that Isabella finally chose to break the silence she had carried for so many years. She took her brother's hand, and in a quiet voice that no longer trembled as it once had, she began to reveal the truth she had buried. She said that what happened in the parking lot that night hadn't been the first time, that for the past 2 years, beginning in the earliest months of her marriage, she had lived inside a fear she hadn't dared confess to anyone. She explained that Chad hadn't always been that way, that there were periods when he was so tender and attentive she believed herself to be the happiest woman alive. But then his rages would descend without warning like sudden storms, and after each one, he would fall to his knees, apologize, weep, and promise he would change, making her soften and forgive him again and again. Salvatore sat in silence and listened without interrupting his sister even once, but from where she stood in the corner of the room, Delaney could see the veins rising across his hand as his grip tightened around the edge of the bed. Isabella went on. and her voice caught when she reached the most painful truth of all, the reason she had remained silent for so long. She said Chad understood exactly what kind of man her brother was. He knew Salvatore possessed enough power and enough ruthlessness to make him disappear from the world with nothing more than a nod, and he had used that knowledge to control her. Chad told her that if she ever revealed even a single word to her brother, Salvatore would surely kill him, and then she would become the widow of a murdered man. Her child would grow up without a father, and her own brother would stain his hands with blood and might pay for it with his freedom. He had planted that fear inside her mind with careful cruelty, and turning her love for her brother into the very chain that kept her bound in silence, convincing her that hiding the truth was the only way to protect the people she loved. And so she endured it alone, year after year, believing that her suffering was a necessary sacrifice. She also said that Chad was calculating in a way that chilled her, that he was always careful never to leave marks where anyone might see them. And whenever he knew she would be meeting her brother or appearing in public, she covered herself in long sleeves, rehearsed smiles, and the appearance of a happy wife, a fragile mask that concealed everything beneath it. She had played that role perfectly each time Salvatore visited. She had laughed, spoken about plans for the future, embraced her brother, and assured him that she was living well, while inside she was breaking apart a little more each day. It was because of Chad's ruthless cunning, and also because Salvatore had wanted so badly to believe that his sister was happy, that he had never examined her life too closely, that this terrible truth had remained hidden from one of the most powerful and perceptive men in the city for all those years. When Isabella finished, the entire room sank into a heavy silence, broken only by her quiet sobs. Salvatore remained motionless. His face didn't twitch, and not a single muscle moved, but his hand had closed into a fist so tight that his knuckles had turned white. In his dark eyes, Delaney saw an anger that didn't erupt into flame but settled into something far more frightening, a coldness like ice, a deadly stillness that revealed the man had already made some decision within himself, and that anyone who had ever caused his sister to shed a tear would soon learn the true price of those tears. After the afternoon when Isabella revealed the truth, one thought clung to Salvatore's mind and refused to let go. It wasn't the image of the man who had harmed his sister, but the small woman in the waitress uniform who had stood quietly in the corner of the room throughout that long afternoon. He couldn't understand why a stranger who didn't know Isabella, who owed her nothing, had been willing to throw herself into danger to save a woman she had never even met, while so many others had merely watched and turned away. For a man accustomed to viewing the world through the lens of profit and calculation, Delaney's actions existed beyond all reason, and it was precisely that mystery that made him want to discover who this woman truly was. So he picked up the phone and called Frank again, but this time, it wasn't to hunt down an enemy. It was to learn about the woman to whom his family owed a debt, and he instructed Frank to uncover everything about Delaney Cole. Not because he intended to harm her, but simply because he needed to understand the person who had entered his family's life so unexpectedly. Within a single day, Frank brought him a thin file, and as Salvatore sat alone in his penthouse reading each line, he gradually felt something tightening inside his chest. What he found wasn't the story of a woman whose life had been easy and abundant, someone who could afford to give kindness away because she had more than enough. It was the exact opposite. Delaney Cole was 27 years old, a single mother raising her child alone in the heart of one of the most expensive cities in the country. Years earlier, while she was still pregnant, the man she had trusted and given her life to had abandoned her. He hadn't merely left. He had taken every dollar of the small savings they had built together and vanished without a word of farewell, leaving her pregnant, penniless, and burdened with a debt she hadn't even known existed. She had given birth alone, raised her child alone, and taught herself how to remain standing on her own 2 feet in a world that had never shown her much kindness. But what truly left Salvatore silent was written in the next section of the file. Delaney's young daughter, a little girl not yet 6 years old named Nora, suffered from an illness that required regular treatment and constant monitoring, and those recurring treatments consumed nearly everything the young mother earned, and often more than that. It was the reason Delaney worked herself to exhaustion through 2 shifts every day, the reason she always appeared worn beyond her years, the reason she seemed to carry an invisible weight upon her shoulders wherever she went. She was drowning beneath mounting hospital expenses and bills she struggled to manage month after month, living at the very edge of collapse, both physically and financially. Yet this was the woman who, while fighting for every dollar needed to care for her sick child, while living a life that had never once spared her, hadn't hesitated to drop her car keys onto the ground and rush to save a stranger in the rain. She had used her own aging car and the little gas money she possessed to carry his sister to the hospital. Salvatore placed the file on the stone table, and for a long time he simply sat there in silence, staring through the glass windows as the city lights began to glow below. He had spent his entire life in a world where every action carried a price, where kindness always concealed an intention, where no one gave anything without expecting something in return. He had grown accustomed to believing that people were generous only when they had more than they needed, and kind only when kindness cost them nothing. Yet before him now was a woman who had given the greatest kindness one human being could offer, the willingness to risk her own safety, not from abundance, but from the deepest place within a life shaped by loss and deprivation. Delaney had nothing. She had no money, no power, no one standing behind her, and even from the bottom of that abyss, she had still chosen to step forward. It forced Salvatore, a man who believed he had already seen every dark corner of the human heart, to reconsider everything he had ever believed about the world. A few days later, when Delaney had just finished her evening shift and stepped out through the restaurant's back door, she was surprised to find Salvatore Marchetti waiting beside his black car, his tall figure casting a shadow beneath the streetlight. He hadn't brought the broad-shouldered men who had accompanied him the first time they met. He stood there alone, and that eased some of her tension, though the familiar caution inside her still rose at once. He told her that he had come to thank her properly, because what she had done for his sister was something he could never forget, and because he was the kind of man who always repaid what he owed. Then he drew a thick envelope from inside his coat, held it out to her, and said this was how he wished to express his gratitude, that the money inside was enough to cover every hardship she was facing, enough to free her from working herself to exhaustion through 2 shifts every day. Delaney looked at the envelope in his hand, and for one brief moment, she understood that the money could change her entire life. It could erase the debts that were strangling her, could pay for the treatments her daughter needed, and that she was still struggling to afford. But she understood something else as well, something deeper. If she accepted that envelope, then what she had done on that rainy night would no longer remain what it had truly been. She shook her head, and in a calm but unwavering voice, she told him she couldn't accept the money. She said she hadn't saved his sister in order to be rewarded, that she had done it because it was the right thing to do, and that if she accepted his money now, she would be turning her actions into a transaction. While kindness wasn't something that could be bought or sold, Salvatore stared at her as though he couldn't believe what he had just heard, because in all his life, no one had ever refused his money. No one had ever stood before such a large sum and calmly shaken their head. He told her that he knew about her circumstances, about her debts, about her daughter, and that he couldn't understand why she would reject something that could release her from every burden she carried. Delaney pressed her lips together when she heard him mention the private details of her life, then answered that yes, her life was difficult, more difficult than he could imagine, but she had carried it alone for years and would continue carrying it alone, because her self-respect was the only thing life hadn't taken from her, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. A long silence stretched between them after those words, and then the conversation turned in another direction when Salvatore, the coldness returning to his face, said that whether she took the money or not no longer mattered. What truly concerned him now was making the man who had harmed his sister pay, and he had his own way of ensuring that Chad would never be able to hurt anyone again. The quiet, icy way he said it made Delaney shiver, because she immediately understood what he meant. To her own surprise, she heard herself objecting fiercely. She told him he couldn't do that if he chose that path, he would lower himself to the same level as the very man he despised. That violence only gave birth to more violence and would never end the cycle. She said Isabella and her unborn child deserved a future unstained by blood and guilt, and that if he truly wanted to protect his sister, what she needed wasn't a brother burdened with more sin, but real justice justice carried out openly and lawfully. Salvatore looked at her. An irritation mixed with surprise flickered through his dark eyes, because no one had ever dared lecture him about right and wrong, and no one had ever challenged the way he chose to protect those he loved. The two of them stood beneath the streetlight, belonging to worlds that couldn't have been more different. One a powerful crime boss accustomed to living by his own rules, the other a poor woman who still held firmly to her faith in what was right, with a chasm between them that seemed impossible to cross. And yet, strangely, it was in that heated clash that some invisible thread quietly began to connect them, because each recognized in the other a strength of will and a depth of heart that couldn't be dismissed. When Salvatore climbed into his car and drove away that night, he knew the woman's words would follow him for a very long time. Frank came to see Salvatore early one morning, and from the moment the loyal man entered the room with an unusually tense expression, Salvatore knew that whatever he was about to say was no small matter. Frank placed a file on the table, much thicker than the one he had brought before, and explained that while digging deeper into Chad Whitmore's life on Salvatore's orders, he had uncovered something none of them had expected, something hidden beneath the surface of what had seemed to be an ordinary abusive husband. Salvatore sat down, opened the file, and as he turned through the pages one by one, his usually composed face gradually became frighteningly cold. What lay before him wasn't merely the trail of a man who beat his wife, but evidence of a betrayal calculated down to the smallest detail. Chad Whitmore hadn't entered Isabella's life by chance, and his marriage to Salvatore's sister had never been the love story everyone believed it to be. The words in the file painted a picture that seemed to freeze the blood in Salvatore's veins. From the very beginning, Chad had known exactly who Salvatore Marchetti was and what he controlled within the city. He wasn't simply the real estate businessman his polished appearance suggested. He was a deliberately planted piece on a larger board, and the hand moving that piece belonged to a rival organization that had long hungered to bring down the empire Salvatore had built. The marriage to Isabella, from their first date to the day of the wedding, had all been a move planned with chilling precision. Chad had approached his sister and used charm and tender words to capture her heart, not because he loved her, but because he wanted to work his way into Salvatore's innermost circle, to become family so he could gain access to secrets, business dealings, and vulnerabilities no outsider could ever reach. For the past 2 years, while Salvatore believed his sister had found a loving home, his most dangerous enemy had in fact been sitting at his family table, smiling at him, shaking his hand, and quietly collecting every fragment of information he could one day use against him. The more Salvatore read, the more he understood that the beatings Chad had inflicted on Isabella weren't simply the outbursts of a violent man who had lost control. They had also been tools of domination and manipulation, a way to keep her trapped in fear and silence, to make certain she would never dare reveal anything that might destroy his plan. He had exploited the love Isabella felt for her brother and turned it into a chain, calculating everything with a cruelty so cold it was almost inhuman. What enraged Salvatore most wasn't that Chad had dared to conspire against his empire, because in Salvatore's world, schemes like that had never been unusual. What he couldn't forgive was that Chad had used his sister, the only innocent person in all these filthy calculations, as a pawn in his game, forcing a trusting and gentle young woman to pay with years of suffering, simply because she had a brother other men wanted to destroy. Salvatore closed the file and sat in silence for a long time, and within that stillness, he felt more clearly than ever the bitterness of a man who had just realized that the fortress he had spent his life building to protect someone he loved had been breached from within by the very hand he had trusted enough to welcome into his home. He had devoted his entire life to guarding against dangers from the outside, raising layer after layer of defense so no enemy could ever reach Isabella. Yet the most dangerous enemy had been the man Salvatore himself had invited through the door, granted the place of family, and trusted enough to give his sister to in marriage. The guilt tormented him even more than the anger, because he understood that his own complacency, his blind belief that his sister was happy, had kept him from seeing the truth that had been directly in front of him all along. But now that every mask had fallen and Chad Whitmore's true face had been fully exposed, Salvatore knew the game had entered a new stage, and this time he would be the one holding the advantage. No one understood how Chad had managed to discover where Isabella was staying after leaving the hospital. A secure apartment Salvatore had arranged for his sister, but one afternoon, just as the guards were changing shifts, he found a way inside and appeared before her. This time, however, he didn't arrive with his usual rage or threatening expression. Instead, the moment Isabella saw him and recoiled in fear, he immediately dropped to his knees on the floor in front of her and began performing the same scene she had witnessed more times than she could count throughout their 2 years of marriage. He looked up at her with reddened eyes, as though struggling to hold back tears, and his voice broke with emotion as he said he knew he had been wrong, that he hated himself for what he had done to her and to their child. He said that night he hadn't been himself, that some kind of demon had taken control of him, and that ever since she left, he had been living in a hell of guilt and regret, unable to eat or sleep, longing only for one chance to make amends. Chad continued his performance with the practiced skill he had refined over the years, touching precisely the emotional chords he knew best within his young wife's heart. He reminded her of the beautiful memories from the beginning, the days when she had believed herself to be the happiest woman alive, and he asked how she could possibly throw all of that away, how she could allow their child to be born without a father beside them. He said he had found a therapist, that this time he truly would change, not with the empty promises he had made before, but with a genuine transformation from the deepest part of his heart. He reached out and lightly touched her trembling hand, and in the gentlest voice he could produce, he whispered that he loved her more than anything in the world, that without her his life had no meaning, and that he was begging her to give him one final chance, just one last chance to prove that he could become the husband and father she and the baby deserved. And Isabella, a gentle and trusting woman with a heart that had always longed to believe in goodness, felt herself wavering once again beneath those sweet words. She looked down at the man kneeling before her, the man she had once loved so deeply, the father of the child moving inside her, and in that moment, all the pain he had caused seemed to fade beneath his tears and solemn promises. A part of her, the fragile part that had led her to forgive him so many times before, began whispering the same familiar words once again, that perhaps this time he was telling the truth, that perhaps people really could change, that a child needed both a mother and a father, that she couldn't carry everything alone. She thought about the uncertain future ahead, about the loneliness of becoming a single mother, about the way other people might look at her, and little by little, those fears began to drown out the voice of reason. Her lips trembled, and she felt her head beginning to lower in an unconscious nod, as though her tender heart were winning once more, as though she were preparing to step back into the same vicious cycle that had imprisoned her for years. In that breathless moment, when she had almost surrendered and was about to speak the words of forgiveness, the boundary between escaping and sinking deeper into darkness had become as fragile as a single thread, and both her fate and the fate of her unborn child seemed to hang upon that one fateful nod. At the very moment Isabella's lips were about to speak the fateful words of forgiveness, the apartment door flew open, and Delaney stepped inside with one of the guards who had just discovered Chad's presence. With a single glance, Delaney understood exactly what was happening. The man kneeling on the floor with tears covering his face, the young woman wavering on the edge of surrender, the suffocating atmosphere of a performance she had once watched destroy another life. Chad was forced to leave under the guard's escort, but before he disappeared behind the door, the look he cast at Delaney was filled with cold hatred. When only the two women remained in the room, Delaney walked over and sat beside Isabella, who was still trembling and confused, her eyes wet from the tender words she had just heard. Delaney took her hand, and she understood that this was a moment when she couldn't remain silent. This was the time to do something she had never done with anyone in all the years of her life, to open the door leading into the most painful part of her past. Delaney gently touched the old silver bracelet around her wrist, a cheap piece of jewelry that had darkened with age, but that she had never once removed, and in a quiet, somber voice, she began telling Isabella the story she had buried inside herself for her entire life. She explained that when she was a child, she had grown up in a home where fear was always present, where her mother, the gentlest and kindest woman she had ever known, lived beneath the hand of a man whose rage could erupt at any moment. She said that her mother had forgiven him too, time after time, She had believed his apologies and his tears, that she had convinced herself she had to endure and give him one more chance for the sake of her child, for the sake of their family, and for the future she had always dreamed of. And with every forgiveness, her mother had bound herself more tightly to a vicious cycle with no escape, persuading herself again and again that next time would be different. Delaney's voice caught when she reached the end of the story. There had come one fateful night when the violence left her mother no chance to forgive again. And what had haunted Delaney throughout her life wasn't only the loss itself, but the knowledge that people had been close enough to hear, close enough to know, and yet not one of them had dared to step forward. No one had knocked on the door. Every one of them had chosen to turn away and pretend that nothing was happening. Tears streamed down Isabella's face as she listened, and Delaney tightened her hold on her hand, telling her that, because she had watched that silence take her mother's life, she could never stand by and watch another woman walk down the same road. She told Isabella that the feeling that kept making her forgive, that kept softening her heart whenever Chad cried, wasn't love. It was a carefully constructed trap, one that used her own kindness and compassion to imprison her. She said that someone who truly loved another person would never force them to live in fear, would never use pain as a means of control, and that promises of change repeated after every act of cruelty were nothing more than links in the chain, holding her captive. Delaney looked directly into Isabella's tear-filled eyes and said that she understood the fear of being alone, understood the belief that a child needed both a mother and a father, but a child raised in a home filled with fear and tears would carry wounds far deeper than a child raised in peace by one strong mother. She said that she had been that child, and she knew the price all too well. Those words, spoken from the deepest place of genuine pain, reached something inside Isabella that no one had ever touched before. She sat in silence for a long time, her tears still falling, but her eyes gradually began to change, shifting from confusion and uncertainty into a clarity she had never possessed. She placed a hand over her stomach, where her little child was growing with each passing day, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt strength rising from within her, a determination that came from no one else but herself. She lifted her head and looked at Delaney, and in a voice that still trembled but now carried a new steadiness, she said that she wouldn't remain silent any longer, that she would stand up and tell the whole truth, not only for herself, but for her child, and for every other woman who had suffered or was still suffering in the darkness. It was the moment when Isabella, for the first time in her life, made a decision about her own future. A few days later, with a new determination beginning to take root inside her, Isabella did something she would never have dared imagine only a short time before. She walked into a police station of her own free will and reported the entire truth. Delaney went with her, sitting beside her throughout the drive and taking her hand whenever she hesitated, and that quiet presence gave Isabella the courage she needed. The officer assigned to the case was a female detective named Bishop, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes that still held a deep sense of compassion. Someone who had spent many years of her career standing beside victims who had no voice of their own. She listened to Isabella with patience and without judgment, and under her gentle guidance, Isabella told her everything, hiding nothing. She spoke about 2 years spent living in fear, about the times Chad hurt her, and then soothed her with empty promises, about the way he had used the love she felt for her brother to control and silence her. Every truth she spoke seemed to lift part of the burden that had weighed on her shoulders for so many years, and though her voice sometimes caught with emotion, she continued until the end, because this time she understood that her silence had never protected anyone. It had only fed the darkness. Detective Bishop carefully recorded every detail, and when Isabella finished, she explained that her statement was extremely important. But to charge a man like Chad Whitmore, a man with money and connections that could help him slip through the cracks in the law, they would need additional witnesses, people who had seen his actions with their own eyes. That was when Delaney spoke. She said she had been there in the parking lot that night, that she had witnessed exactly what Chad had done to his wife, and that she was willing to come forward as a witness and testify to everything she had seen. Detective Bishop looked at her with both gratitude and seriousness, then warned Delaney that standing as a witness against someone like Chad wouldn't be simple, that it could bring danger and trouble into her own life. Delaney understood that clearly. She knew that in her circumstances, as a single mother struggling to care for a sick child, she had too much to lose and too little with which to protect herself. But she also understood that if she stepped back now, if she chose her own safety and turned away, then she would be no different from the people who had remained silent on the night her mother needed them most. That was something she could never forgive herself for. So without hesitation, she affirmed her decision and accepted whatever risks might come. With Isabella's statement, Delaney's testimony, and the evidence Detective Bishop quickly gathered, the machinery of the law began to move. Only a few days later, a court order was delivered directly into Chad Whitmore's hands, officially beginning legal proceedings against him. It was the first time in his life that he had been forced to face consequences for the things he had always believed he could hide forever. The first time he realized that the perfect facade he had worked so hard to create was beginning to crack. When he learned that Delaney was the one who had stepped forward as a witness, the poor waitress he had once treated with contempt, the woman who had dared interfere in his affairs from the very beginning on that fateful night, the anger inside him hardened into something deeper and far more dangerous. In his eyes, she was no longer merely a troublesome outsider. She had become a direct threat, someone capable of destroying his entire plan and future. His cold attention now turned fully toward Delaney, and a dark intention began to form in his mind, because he was not the kind of man who would ever sit quietly and accept defeat. He would do whatever it took to silence the woman who had dared stand against him, no matter what price had to be paid. Chad's hatred refused to remain still, and not long after receiving the court order, he found a way to intercept Delaney one evening, just as she finished her shift, and stepped into the area behind the restaurant. He didn't lay a hand on her, because he was clever enough to know that doing so now would only add more charges against him. But the weapon he chose was even crueler than his fists. He used words. He approached her with a cold smile on his lips, and in a voice so gentle it was chilling. He told her she should think very carefully about what she was doing. He said he knew she was a mother, knew she had a little girl she loved more than her own life, and that a wise mother always understood that her child's safety had to come before everything else. He never made a single direct threat, but the way he mentioned her daughter, the meaning in his eyes, was enough to plant an icy terror deep inside Delaney. He quietly told her that the world was a dangerous place, that unfortunate things could happen to anyone, and that she could easily spare herself and the people she loved from every kind of trouble simply by withdrawing her statement and remaining silent, as she should have done from the beginning. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Delaney frozen in the empty lot, cold spreading through her entire body. That night, after returning home and quietly looking into the room where her little daughter slept peacefully under the care of their kind neighbor, Delaney gently closed the door and stepped outside. She didn't want her child to wake and see her like this. She drove back to the parking lot behind the restaurant, the place where everything had begun, and sat alone inside her old car in the darkness and silence of the night. There, when no one could see her, when she no longer had to force herself to appear strong for anyone, Delaney finally allowed the tears she had held back for so long to break free. She cried as she had never permitted herself to cry before, because the weight of everything pressed together had become too much for her to carry alone. She thought about the shifts that stretched on until she could barely stand, about the mountain of debts that seemed impossible to repay, about her daughter's treatments and the constant fear that she wouldn't be able to afford them. And now, added to all those burdens, was the most terrible fear any mother could know, the fear that her own courage might bring danger upon the child she loved more than anything in the world. In that moment of weakness, a thought slipped into her mind and whispered that perhaps she should stop, perhaps she should step away, perhaps protecting her daughter mattered more than every principle of right and wrong in the world. She asked herself why she always had to be the one who endured, why life kept placing one burden after another upon her shoulders, why she couldn't simply turn away and live a quiet life like everyone else. She felt utterly small and alone, a woman with no money, no power, and no one truly standing behind her, facing a man who seemed to possess everything he needed to crush her. But then, in the darkness of the car, her trembling fingers unconsciously found the old silver bracelet around her wrist, and when she touched the cold, smooth metal, something inside her began to settle. The bracelet was the only keepsake she had left from her mother, the woman who had died because everyone around her had chosen silence. And as Delaney traced its familiar contours with her fingertips, she could almost hear her mother's voice reaching her from the past. Delaney closed her eyes, drew in a deep breath, and little by little, her tears stopped falling. She understood that if she stepped back now, if she allowed fear to defeat her, she wouldn't only be betraying Isabella and herself. She would also be betraying the memory of the mother she had lost, and she would be teaching her daughter that when faced with evil, a person could turn away and run. That wasn't the lesson she wanted to leave behind for her child. She thought of Nora, of her clear eyes and her smile, and she understood that the best way to protect her daughter wasn't to teach her to bow before fear, but to become an example of courage that her child could one day follow. With that thought, Delaney opened her eyes, wiped the last tears from her face, and sat upright in the car. The fear was still there. It hadn't disappeared, but it no longer had the power to defeat her. She had reached the very bottom of despair and exhaustion, and from that lowest place, she found the strength to rise once again, to continue along the path she had chosen, more determined than ever that she wouldn't retreat. The next morning, when Delaney arrived at the hospital for her daughter's regularly scheduled treatment, something unexpected was waiting for her at the billing desk. The employee looked at the records on the screen, then raised her eyes and told Delaney that every outstanding medical bill connected to her daughter had been paid in full. Not only that, but all the treatments scheduled for the months ahead had already been covered as well. Delaney stood frozen, certain there had to be some kind of mistake, because she knew exactly how much she still owed, a sum so overwhelming that whenever she thought about it at night, sleep became impossible. She asked again and again, insisting that the employee check everything carefully, but the answer remained the same. Someone had quietly taken upon themselves the entire financial burden that had weighed on her shoulders for so many years. Someone had silently loosened the knot that had been tightening around her life, without leaving a name or asking for anything in return. While she was still struggling to comprehend it, she suddenly noticed another detail, something she had vaguely sensed during the past several days, but hadn't dared believe. Whenever her daughter went to school, or when the little girl was taken to the park by their kind neighbor, there always seemed to be a quiet presence somewhere in the distance, a discreet figure watching from a safe distance, an unseen protection of which the child remained completely unaware as she continued to laugh and play in perfect peace. Delaney followed the few clues she had, and when the truth finally emerged, she could hardly believe what she had discovered. The person who had quietly paid every one of her debts, the person who had secretly assigned men to watch over her daughter and make certain she was always safe, was none other than Salvatore Marchetti. What stunned her even more was the realization that his silent protection hadn't begun only after Chad threatened her. It had started much earlier, on the very first rainy night when she brought Isabella to the hospital. From the moment Salvatore investigated her circumstances and learned about the burdens she had been carrying alone, he had quietly intervened, not with the envelope she had proudly refused, but in a way so discreet that she couldn't reject it, because she hadn't even known it was happening. He had respected her dignity exactly as she had asked him to, but at the same time, in his own quiet way, he had continued to watch over and protect both her and her child. When Delaney understood everything, a powerful rush of emotion rose inside her, something she couldn't find a name for. For so many years, she had believed she was entirely alone in the world, that she had to carry every burden herself because no one was truly standing behind her, that she alone was responsible for the survival of both herself and her daughter. That belief had become part of who she was, a hard shell she had wrapped around herself in order to survive. Yet now she realized that throughout the time when she had felt most alone and desperate, even on the night when she had sat crying by herself in the parking lot and believed the whole world had turned its back on her, someone had actually been standing quietly behind her all along, supporting her without asking for thanks or expecting anything in return. After so many years of struggling alone, the feeling of being protected by someone made her heart seem to break into pieces, not from pain, but from a gentle, overwhelming emotion that tightened her throat. She thought of Salvatore, of the cold and commanding man she had first met at the hospital, of the moment when she had accidentally seen him sitting helplessly beside his sister's bed, and of the fierce argument they had shared beneath the streetlight. She realized that behind that shell of steel was a man capable of loving and protecting more deeply than anyone she had ever known, a man who expressed what he felt not through beautiful words, but through quiet acts no one was meant to see. And in that moment, something inside Delaney changed forever. The invisible thread that had first formed between them during their earlier clash now became clearer and warmer than ever before. For the first time in many years, after keeping her heart tightly closed in order to protect herself, Delaney felt it begin to stir, a true and powerful feeling she could no longer deny. For the man who had silently become a source of strength for her and her daughter, even when she hadn't known he was there, Chad wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat easily, and when his veiled threats failed to make Delaney retreat as he had expected, he decided to make a more reckless and desperate move. Late one evening, just as Delaney locked the restaurant's back door and stepped into the familiar lot, he was already waiting for her, and this time he wasn't alone. Several hard-looking men lingered among the cars parked in the shadows. The place that had once witnessed her act of courage now became the stage for another confrontation, but this time the air was thick with danger and dark intent. Chad approached her, every trace of false politeness stripped away, revealing the cruelty beneath. He told her that he had given her the chance to choose the easy path, but she had been foolish enough to refuse, and now he would force her to withdraw her testimony by whatever means necessary. Delaney stepped back, her heart pounding as her hand searched for the phone inside her pocket. But one of the men blocked her path, closing her inside their circle. Fear surged through her, but she clenched her teeth and held her ground, determined not to let them see her trembling, even though she understood that the situation had become truly dangerous. What Chad didn't know was that Salvatore had been watching his every move for some time. Ever since uncovering Chad's true conspiracy and learning that he had threatened Delaney, Salvatore had ordered his men to quietly monitor everything Chad did, and the moment he and his men arrived at the parking lot, word was sent back immediately. Just as Chad signaled for his men to move in and close around Delaney, the sharp sound of tires skidding across the wet pavement cut through the night, and the familiar black vehicle sped into the lot, stopping across the exit. Salvatore stepped out with his men, and in an instant, the balance of the confrontation shifted completely. He moved forward with a deadly calm, his eyes locked on Chad with a coldness more terrifying than any display of rage. Chad's men, though greater in number, began to hesitate when they realized who had arrived, because in the city's underworld, the name Salvatore Marchetti carried enough weight to make even the most reckless men think twice. Chad, cornered and believing he had nothing left to lose, lunged forward, and a struggle erupted among the men in the parking lot. Salvatore's people quickly overpowered Chad's men, and amid the chaos, Salvatore went straight for the man who had harmed his sister. The two men collided, and though Chad was far from weak, he was no match for someone like Salvatore, a man driven not only by strength but by fury that had been restrained for far too long. Within moments, Salvatore had him completely subdued, pinning him down and stripping him of every chance to resist. Chad lay there, utterly helpless for the first time in his life, staring up into the face of the man holding him down, and genuine terror flashed in his eyes, because he understood that his fate now rested entirely in the hands of the man he had foolishly provoked. Salvatore tightened his grip, and in that moment all the anger, all the guilt, and every image of his sister suffering through 2 years of pain crashed through his mind at once. This was the man who had deceived his entire family, used his innocent sister as a pawn, forced her to live in fear and tears, and threatened the woman who had saved her life. With the power and strength he possessed, Salvatore could make this man disappear from the world right then and there. No one could stop him, and part of him, the part that had spent years living by the ruthless laws of the underworld, screamed for him to do exactly that, to end everything once and for all. His hand tightened further, his entire body drawn taut like a bow pulled to its limit, and Chad, sensing that his life hung upon that single moment, stopped struggling altogether. The entire parking lot seemed to fall into a deadly silence, every eye fixed on Salvatore, and the fragile line between justice and crime, between the man he wanted to become and the man his past had made him, had never stood before him with such brutal clarity. It was in that merciless moment, when everything seemed poised to cross a line from which there could be no return, that Delaney's voice tore through the deadly silence of the parking lot. She had broken free from the circle around her and run toward them, and now she stood only a few steps away from Salvatore, her eyes filled with tears, but her voice carrying an extraordinary steadiness. She called his name and begged him to stop. She told him she understood the anger inside him, understood everything this man had done to the people he loved, and knew that he possessed more than enough strength to end Chad's life right then and there. But that was precisely why, she said, this was the most important moment of all, the moment that would decide what kind of man he truly was. She told him that if he did it, if he allowed his fury to guide him and struck down the man beneath him, then with his own hands, he would become the very thing he hated most. He would no longer be any different from the man lying at his feet, and the darkness he had spent his whole life trying to protect his sister from would become the very darkness he himself spread into the world. Delaney stepped closer, and her voice softened, though every word still carried an immense weight. She reminded him of the niece or nephew who would soon be born, the little child Isabella had nearly sacrificed her life to protect. She said that if he stained his hands with blood that night, the child would grow up beneath a dark shadow, carrying the truth that the uncle they loved had become a killer, and that stain would follow his entire family for the rest of their lives. She asked whether that was truly the gift he wanted to leave for an innocent child, whether that was how he wished to honor the memory of his parents, who had also been taken from him by this very kind of violence. She told him that true justice didn't lie in punishing Chad with his own hands according to the laws of darkness. It lay in forcing him to face the consequences openly, in allowing the entire world to see his true face, in making him live out the rest of his days amid the complete collapse of everything he had once possessed. That, she said, would be the real victory, a victory that wouldn't cost Salvatore his own soul. Her words cut through the armor he had worn for so many years like blades, reaching something buried so deeply inside him that he had almost forgotten it still existed. He remained there, breathing heavily, his hands still clenched, while the fiercest struggle he had ever known unfolded inside his mind. On one side was the familiar call of a lifetime shaped by violence, the voice whispering that only death was fitting for a man who had caused so much suffering, that it was the only way to make certain Chad could never harm anyone again. But on the other side was the voice of the woman standing before him, a woman who had shown him that kindness and righteousness could still exist, even in a cruel world, a woman who had climbed out of the deepest pit of suffering and somehow preserved the purity of her soul. He looked down at Chad lying helpless beneath him, then lifted his eyes to Delaney and met her gaze. In her eyes he saw no judgment, he saw faith, a belief that he was a better man than the world that had shaped him. Then, slowly, Salvatore loosened his hand. His whole body, which had been drawn tight like a bowstring, gradually relaxed, and he rose to his feet, leaving Chad gasping on the ground. He turned to his men and ordered them to hold Chad securely, not so they could punish him according to the laws of darkness, but so they could hand him over to the authorities along with every piece of evidence Salvatore had quietly gathered concerning all his crimes, from the abuse of his sister to the conspiracy against him, and every other unlawful act Chad had committed. Salvatore's power and network, instead of being used to end a man's life, would now be used to ensure that Chad couldn't manipulate the system or escape, that he would be forced to face justice fully and completely. In that moment of letting go, Salvatore Marchetti did something he had never done before in his life. He chose justice over vengeance. He chose light over darkness. And that choice changed him forever, transforming him from a crime boss who had known only the law of power into a man who had finally discovered a greater kind of strength, the strength of mercy and decency. A few weeks after that fateful night in the parking lot, while the legal proceedings were gradually being completed, Isabella gave birth to her child in a hospital filled with gentle light, with Salvatore waiting outside the delivery room and Delaney holding her hand tightly throughout the labor. The baby was born healthy, her strong cry ringing out with vibrant life, and when the tiny child was placed in Isabella's arms, all the pain and fear she had endured for so many years seemed to dissolve, giving way to a happiness that was pure and complete. It was a little girl, and as Isabella looked into her daughter's tiny face, she understood that every brave choice she had made, the decision to break her silence, the decision to stand up and fight, had all been worth it, because now her child would be born and raised in a world no longer shadowed by fear. Salvatore entered the room, and the man who had always been so cold and unyielding couldn't hide his tears when he held his little niece for the first time, feeling the fragile yet powerful life in his arms, the life that had come so close to being taken away on that rainy night. When the trial finally began, the entire family entered the courtroom with a completely different spirit. They were no longer frightened victims trembling in the darkness, but people who had reclaimed their strength and their voices. The courtroom was packed, and the air was heavy with tension as each piece of evidence was brought into the light. Security footage from the parking lot on that fateful night was shown, allowing everyone to see clearly what had truly happened and what Delaney had courageously done when she stepped forward instead of turning away. Isabella's testimony filled the courtroom, this time without the slightest trace of fear in her voice, as she revealed the entire truth about 2 years spent in suffering and the ways she had been manipulated and controlled. Delaney also took the stand, calmly and clearly recounting everything she had witnessed with her own eyes. Most important of all, the evidence Salvatore had quietly gathered was presented to the court, exposing not only Chad's abuse, but also his calculated schemes of fraud and betrayal, the entire dark game he had constructed from the beginning. One by one, every layer of Chad's disguise was stripped away before everyone in the room, and the man who had once believed he could manipulate everything forever now sat with his head bowed, utterly broken. When the judge read the sentence, the entire courtroom fell silent. Chad Whitmore was convicted of the full range of his crimes and given an appropriate prison sentence, one long enough to ensure that he would never again be able to harm anyone, and long enough to bring justice for all the suffering he had caused. There were no cheers and no words of triumph in that moment, only a deep breath of relief that seemed to spread through the courtroom, as though an invisible weight that had pressed down on everyone for so long had finally been lifted. It wasn't a victory of revenge, but a victory of justice carried out openly and lawfully, just as Delaney had always believed it should be, and just as Salvatore had bravely chosen in that decisive moment in the parking lot. Amid it all, the sight that touched every heart in the courtroom was Isabella sitting in the front row, holding her little daughter tightly in her arms. She looked down at the angelic face of her sleeping child, who knew nothing of the storms her mother had endured in order to protect her, and in the young mother's eyes there was a peace she hadn't known for a very long time. That child, born from adversity but raised in love and protection, was the clearest living symbol of a new beginning, of light overcoming darkness. Salvatore placed a hand on his sister's shoulder, while Delaney stood beside them, and the three people, who had once been strangers, were now bound together by a journey that had changed all their lives. When they walked out of the courthouse together beneath the morning sunlight, a chapter filled with pain and turmoil finally came to an end, making way for the new pages still waiting ahead. Many months passed after the trial came to an end, and Delaney's life entered an entirely new chapter. With the money she had saved and the tireless effort she had poured into her dream, she was finally able to open a small, welcoming restaurant on a quiet street corner, a place where she could prepare the food she loved with her own hands and greet every customer with a sincere smile. It was a dream she had carried for years but had never truly believed she could reach, and now it had become real, not because of the money she had once proudly refused, but because of her own hard work and unbreakable will, along with Salvatore's quiet and genuine support. He had come to understand that what Delaney needed wasn't charity or pity, but someone who truly believed in her and was willing to stand beside her. And that was exactly what he gave her. Between two people who had once belonged to completely different worlds, the bond born from gratitude on that rainy night slowly grew into something far deeper and more enduring, a kind of understanding and respect neither of them had ever found in anyone else. Salvatore, the man who had once known only power and cold restraint, learned from her the true meaning of kindness, while Delaney, the woman who had locked her heart away to protect herself, learned that not every man was a shadow from her past, and that she could open herself to trust and love once more. On a bright and beautiful afternoon, their small family gathered in the courtyard behind Delaney's restaurant, while the clear laughter of the children rang beneath the warm golden sunlight. Delaney's little daughter had grown much healthier after receiving the full treatment she needed, her cheeks glowing pink and her smile shining like sunlight as she ran and played beside her baby cousin, Isabella's little girl, who rested safely in her mother's arms. Watching the two children play in such perfect peace filled the adults with a gentle happiness, because they understood that their courage and love had made that beautiful moment possible. Their story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that sometimes one brave step taken by an ordinary person is enough to bring light into the darkest place. That kindness given from the very depths of hardship is the noblest kindness of all, and that silence in the face of wrongdoing has never protected anyone. Only the courage to speak can break the cycles of suffering and open the way to a new beginning for everyone. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue bringing you more meaningful and compelling stories every day. How did you feel about Delaney and Salvatore's journey? And what part of this story moved you the most? Please leave a comment below so we can hear the thoughts that come from deep within your heart. Thank you for spending your time with us until the very final moments. We wish everyone listening to this story good health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.